Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you've joined me. On last week's podcast, we examined Jacob's worldview, which led him to the fords of the Jabbok River, where he had an encounter with the Lord. And under the Lord's exposure light, he learned that his worldview was the root of all the misery and pain, not only in his life, but also in the lives of those he professed to love. And when the Lord asked him his name, Jacob's response was a confession of his failure and not just what people called him. He was not the man he should have been. But as soon as he answered, God told him his name was no longer Jacob, but Israel, a prince with God, for he had wrestled with God until he had prevailed. And if you would like to listen to last week's podcast, I'll put a link below in the description. This week, I'm going to examine the lives and worldviews of Jacob's 11 sons, concentrating mostly on Joseph. Now, most of us know Joseph's story, but his life played out against the background of his brother's spiritual declension. Declension means a condition of decline or failure. If his brothers were going to fulfill their destiny in God, then Joseph was absolutely necessary to God's work. And for that purpose, God sent Joseph to Egypt so he could save his brothers alive. This saving alive was not about selling his brothers grain in the midst of a famine. During Isaac's lifetime, there had also been another famine, but the Lord told Isaac to remain in Canaan and he would receive 100-fold harvest. So food wasn't the issue. The Lord can always provide food. The brothers were suffering under a heavy burden of sin, guilt, and condemnation that they couldn't bear. And every year they sank deeper and deeper under its weight. What they needed was forgiveness and restoration, and only Joseph could provide that for them. The jealousy and resentment that had poisoned the relationship between Leah and Rachel didn't remain confined to the women. As Leah's 8 sons, the 6 she bore, and the 2 that were born of Zilpah grew up, they became indignant at Jacob's treatment of their mother, and by extension of them. Were they loved? Perhaps, but they knew their mother wasn't. And if Laban hadn't deceived him, Jacob wouldn't have married her. And he didn't love her, so he tolerated her presence in his life. Jacob's tolerance flowed toward them. They believed they only received scraps of love from their father's table. Jacob had disinherited Reuben, Simeon, and Levi because of their contempt and rebellion. This left Judah as his heir by birth. And as far as he was concerned, Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, was his heir. And this was the meaning behind the coat of many colors. By dressing Joseph in that coat, Jacob was telling all his sons that Joseph was the true leader of the family. Joseph's elevation over them was the most egregious of the slights and insults Leah's sons felt they had received from their father. Their dislike for Jacob now spilled over to Joseph, and they treated their youngest brother, until Benjamin was born, with the same contempt they treated their father. And it was during this time that Joseph began to dream. He was in awe of what the Lord showed him about his future. God had destined him to reign over his brothers and even his father and mother. He was young and unwise, so he told his brothers all the dreams the Lord had shown him. Perhaps by revealing his dreams, he was defending himself against his brother's constant antagonism. His disclosure had the opposite effect. His brothers grew more jealous and bitter about his place in the family. One of the ways Leah's sons showed their disrespect for their fathers was that they failed to carry out his orders on a regular basis. They did what they wanted without care to Jacob's reputation or the future financial stability of the family. Jacob had instilled in Joseph the responsibility that came with being the heir. He was to make sure his brothers did as they were told, for the family's future prosperity rested upon it. Joseph never found them in compliance, so he detailed all their trespasses to Jacob. Well, needless to say, his reports did nothing to endear him to them. So this is where we're going to pick up the story. Jacob had sent Joseph to find his brothers who were with the flocks. Joseph finally tracked them down, and when the brothers saw him coming toward them, they plotted to rid themselves of this thorn in their collective sides. In the group of 10 were also Bilhah's sons, Gad and Naphtali. Their relationship with Joseph should have been stronger than their relationship with Leah's sons. After all, Rachel had promised to raise them as her own. But Rachel had died years ago outside of Bethlehem, so perhaps in her absence they gravitated toward the other 8 and absorbed their contempt of their father. And while the brothers schemed to rid themselves of Joseph, Gad and Naphtali didn't put up much of a protest. When Joseph joined them, the brothers ripped off his coat and threw him into an empty cistern. They ignored his pleas of help while they decided the best way to kill him. The only one who came to Joseph's defense was Reuben, but he wasn't overt about it. He just told his brothers they weren't murderers. It would be best to leave Joseph where he was and let nature take its course. But he only proposed that to buy time. Once his brothers had moved the flocks to other pastures, he would come back and free Joseph from his prison. Now, for some reason the Bible doesn't specify, Reuben had left the group. That left 9 men sitting next to the cistern, eating their lunch, all the while listening to Joseph plead for his life. And as they ate, a caravan of Ishmaelites passed by. Judah came up with a whole new plan. Instead of killing Joseph, they should just sell him to the Ishmaelites. That way he would be out of their lives for good and they would gain some pocket money for all their troubles. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver, and the last they heard from their little brother was his cries for help as the caravan continued on its way to Egypt. Reuben returned only to find an empty cistern, and when the brothers told him what they had done, he had a choice to make because there is always a choice to be made. He could have ridden off after the caravan and freed Joseph, but then what? Joseph would surely tell Jacob what had happened, and Jacob's response would be to disinherit them all. He decided to protect his brothers and leave Joseph to his fate. They took the coat and shredded it and dipped it in goat's blood to make it appear as if he had been killed by a wild animal. Then they gave the coat to Jacob and asked him if he recognized it. Well, of course he did. He reached the conclusion they hoped he would. His son had been killed by a bear or lion. The brothers sighed in relief. Let Jacob be inconsolable. They had rid themselves of Joseph, and no one was the wiser. Well, it might be true that no one was the wiser, but the brothers knew what they had done. And even though they resented their father, he was still their father. They lived with his suffocating grief every day. There was no escape from it. They had to live with what they had done, but it ate at them and corrupted any spiritual life they might have had. To the Lord, they were the genesis of a nation, but as men, they were altogether inconsistent with the position they were to inherit. So what of Joseph? He had been sent to Egypt by God's providence. If the brothers were ever going to fulfill the destiny God had spoken over them, they would need someone to stand in the gap on their behalf. Joseph was the link between his brothers' tragic condition and God's whole purpose for them. But before he could stand in the gap, God had to perform a great work in him. Joseph's dreams foretold of a reigning life. Well, this was his understanding of them anyway. But now he was a slave in Egypt. How does one rule and reign from the lowest place in society? He was sold to Potiphar, who recognized God's favor upon his life, and he gave Joseph the administration of his estate. Potiphar's wife enters the story as the temptress to disrupt God's work in his life. She begged him to come and lie with him. He deflected his advances by staying true to his integrity. He wouldn't sin against Potiphar or against God. But one day, when they were alone in the house, she used the opportunity to proposition him again. He refused, but she grabbed him. He jerked away and fled, but left his robe in her hands. Humiliated by his rejection, she showed her husband the robe as proof of what she was saying was true. Potiphar didn't give Jacob a chance to defend himself. He had him dragged off to prison, a dark and dank place that smelled like unwashed bodies and urine. Night after night, Joseph laid on his pallet and wondered why this was happening to him. His imprisonment eroded his faith in the dreams God had given him. If he hadn't been able to figure out how to make them come true when he was a slave, how could he make them come true now that he was a forgotten prisoner in an Egyptian jail? Why would God give him dreams if they would never come true? He didn't understand why he was suffering, and he didn't understand what God was doing in his life. It was so easy to serve God when he was to be the master and everyone was kneeling before him. Now he was the one doing the scraping and the bowing. It took time, but he finally admitted to himself that the only reason he told his brothers about his dreams was because he was selfish and self-serving. His brothers were always mistreating him, and he wanted them to know that God was going to exalt him over them. Oh, how he planned to enjoy that moment when they knelt before him and begged him for his favor. But how Joseph interpreted his dreams wasn't the reason God gave them to him. God had chosen him as part of the heavenly purpose, which was still at work to rectify the closed doors suffered in the garden. But for that to happen, Joseph would have to let loose of his selfish interpretation of his dreams. He needed to learn the reason why God had laid hold of him. He had to see God's hand in all the setbacks and sufferings he thought were so wrong and unfair. In the scope of eternity, the slights he endured didn't matter. God had a far greater purpose for him than his petty revenge. He could enter a far nobler destiny if he could learn to forgive. He could see his brothers set free to live in God's fullness. To teach him how to serve, the Lord placed Joseph in a school where he had no name or voice, for he would only learn to reign when he learned to serve without complaint and bitterness. He had to be emptied to be filled. He had to be brought low to be exalted. For the time was coming when his dreams would come true. His brothers would appear before him. How would he handle the situation? Well, most of us are probably familiar with the next part of the story. Pharaoh had dreamed a dream no one could interpret. His cupbearer remembered Joseph from his stint in prison. While there, he dreamed a dream that he couldn't interpret. Joseph had a reputation among the inmates of being able to interpret dreams, so the cupbearer told Joseph his. Joseph assured him that Pharaoh was no longer angry with him and would restore him to his former position. The cupbearer told Pharaoh about Joseph, and Pharaoh had Joseph brought from prison. He interpreted the dream and even told Pharaoh how to prepare for the upcoming famine so Egypt could survive. Pharaoh recognized God's wisdom and favor was upon him, so he elevated Joseph to second in command in Egypt and ordered all his servants to obey him. The famine wasn't confined to Egypt. It swept through the entire Levant. Crops failed and rivers dried up. There was food in Egypt if you had enough money to pay, and Jacob had enough money. He sent his sons south to purchase grain. The brothers were standing in line when Joseph saw them. He instructed the guards to bring them to him. And when the brothers saw the Egyptian governor standing before them, they bowed low to the ground. Joseph accused them of being spies. They hurriedly explained who they were. They were 10 of 12 sons. One brother was dead, and the youngest brother had remained in Canaan with their father. Joseph told them he didn't believe their story, but he would give them an opportunity to prove themselves. He would release one of them to return to Canaan and bring the youngest brother to Egypt. Then he put them in prison to give them time to think it over. 3 days later, he released them and changed the conditions. He would only hold one of them in prison until the rest of them returned to Egypt with the brother. And if they failed, he would sentence all of them to death. The brothers began to speak Hebrew, thinking the Egyptian wouldn't understand them, but Joseph understood every word. They declared God's justice was finally being served on them for what they had done to Joseph all those many years ago. Joseph couldn't control his emotions any longer. He left the room and wept. And when he finally returned, he chose Simeon, had him bound, and led away. He released the rest of them to return home and do as he had instructed them to do. Later that night, while they were feeding their donkeys, they found their money bags in the grain sacks. Not only would the governor think them spies, now he would think them thieves. Why was God doing this to them? When they arrived home, they told Jacob everything that had happened to them. Jacob erupted in anger. Why had they told the governor about Benjamin? They tried to explain, but Jacob refused to listen. He wouldn't allow Benjamin to go to Egypt. And if his refusal cost Simeon his life, then so be it. At this moment, the brothers were reaping what they had sown. They alone were to blame for Jacob's refusal to allow Benjamin to return to Egypt with them. Rachel was gone. Joseph was gone. And Benjamin was all Jacob had left of Rachel. Jacob's refusal, though, put the entire family at risk. Reuben told his father if he failed to bring Benjamin home, Jacob could kill his 2 sons. Again, Jacob refused. There was nothing more the brothers could say. The famine increased in severity, and the food they had acquired in Egypt had run out. Jacob told his sons to return to Egypt and buy more. They just stared at him. The Egyptian had been clear. Unless Benjamin came with them, they would be executed as spies. Once more, Jacob refused to allow Benjamin to go with them. Judah became the voice of reason. He asked his father to entrust Benjamin to him. If anything happened to Benjamin, Jacob could take his grief out on him. But time was of the essence. They should have returned months ago. Even now, the Egyptians might be hunting for them. Reluctantly, Jacob agreed. The brothers prepared for the trip, and since they had found their money in grain sacks, they took double the price for grain. When they arrived in Egypt, Joseph was waiting for them. He invited them to dinner and had Simeon released from prison. The brothers sat at one table while Joseph ate at another table elevated above them. And while they ate, Joseph instructed his steward to hide his silver divination cup in Benjamin's grain sacks. And after dinner, he told his brothers they were free to return home in peace. Once they were gone, he sent guards to arrest them all for theft. The brothers trembled before him. They pleaded their innocence. If one of them had stolen the cup, then that man would pay for his crime with his life, and the rest of them would become the governor's slaves. Joseph partially agreed. Only the man who had stolen the cup would pay with his life. The rest would be free to return to Canaan. One by one, the bags were spilled out, beginning with Reuben and working backwards according to their birth order. The brothers were far too agitated to realize the Egyptian knew in what order they had been born. Finally, the guards searched Benjamin's sack. The brothers breathed in relief. Benjamin was no thief. Yet when the guards spilled out the bags, they found the silver cup. Judah pleaded for Benjamin's life. If he were to die, it would cause their father's death. The governor could punish him instead, but let Benjamin return home. It was too much for Joseph, a son of Leah pleading for the life of a son of Rachel. He ordered everyone but his brothers from the room. Tears flowed down his cheeks as he told them who he truly was. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Well, the brothers didn't know what to make of this weeping Egyptian confessing to be the brother they had sold into slavery. They just stared at him. I am Joseph, he repeated. If Joseph thought it was for this moment that God had brought him to Egypt, he would be wrong. Like I stated earlier, the Lord had commanded Isaac to remain in the land during a famine and had provided a substantial harvest. So if food wasn't the issue, what was? Why had God sent Joseph to preserve a family alive? God's answer would be revealed 17 years later. Now, the brothers always believed that the only reason Joseph hadn't retaliated against them was because of Jacob. But after Jacob died, they realized there was nothing to prevent Joseph from taking his revenge. So they lied and told him that their father had commanded him to forgive them for what they had done. And when Joseph realized his brothers were terrified of him, he began to weep. His brothers still carried the weight and guilt of their actions. Their betrayal of him had been a drag upon their hearts. They couldn't stand before him without feeling guilt and shame. It was at this moment Joseph truly understood his dreams. At the sight of Joseph's tears, his brothers fell down before him. We're your servants. Joseph knelt and reached out his hands to them. I forgive you, he told them. I forgave you a long time ago. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God sent me here to save your lives. Not for grain, for grain can always be had, but for the one thing they needed above all else. They needed Joseph to forgive them and release them from the guilt that had consumed their lives. They couldn't forgive themselves. Only Joseph could do that. God had not failed any of them. Leah's resentment and jealousy toward Rachel had shaped her son's worldviews. And after Rachel died, Jacob didn't attempt to disguise his favoritism toward Joseph. The brothers' hatred toward their father, and by extension Joseph, caused them to sell him into slavery. Like chips off the old blocks, they lied to cover up what they had done, except they weren't Jacob, who didn't care who he had to hurt in order to obtain what he desired. Their lie wore at them and led them into a state of spiritual declension. Things weren't as God meant them to be. The brothers no longer answered to his thought for them. And God couldn't leave them in that state, for their destiny was to grow into a nation. He would set among the surrounding nations to be a light so the Gentiles would know his goodness. God had to call them back to their divine purpose. His means of doing so was the object of their hatred. Joseph's dreams shaped his worldview by allowing him to view himself as his brother's master instead of their constant target. He could have held on to his worldview and probably would have died forgotten and alone in prison. But he allowed God to work in his life. Through all that he had suffered, God taught him to release the smallness of his thinking in order to serve a greater heavenly purpose. His brothers viewed everything through the lens of their guilt. Their consciences were constantly accusing them, and their worldview only reinforced their guilt. When the Egyptians spoke sharply to them, they were the ones who brought up Joseph and their belief that God was finally punishing them for what they had done. Now, after Jacob died, they lied once more to forestall the punishment they believed Joseph was about to inflict on them. But when he forgave them instead, they were finally set free from the burden they had carried for decades. Now, if you liked what you heard, please hit the subscribe button and the like button so you can be notified when the next podcast drops. Next week, I'll examine the worldview of the generation that came out of Egypt. This generation shared a collective worldview that opposed God with every step they took. In the end, they refused to change the way they thought about God, His promise to give them the land, and especially about what they thought about themselves. That's what I'm hoping to accomplish with these podcasts, to show all the reasons why it is so important we repent or change our thinking. Our worldviews keep us imprisoned in our own self-interest, but God won't minister to our selfishness. Just like He did with Joseph, He's calling and dealing with all of us to live for a higher purpose than just ourselves. So I will see you next week. Bye.